Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Can waterboarding be defended? George W. Bush believes it can, and so does Douglas Feith, one of his former advisors, who'll join me here in the studio. We'll speak to the man with one of the least enviable jobs in Europe, the finance minister of Greece, but he's got lots to say. And former England captain Michael Vaughan will give us his thoughts on scandals in world cricket and the upcoming Ashes series only 2 weeks away. But first, Myanmar and the world's most famous political prisoner, Aung San Suu Kyi. Reports are coming out today that Myanmar's military authorities have signed an order authorizing the release of the democratic leader, which could happen on Saturday. Could have been Friday, but now it seems more like Saturday if it happens. The Nobel laureate has spent 15 of the past 21 years under house arrest. So will Ms. Suu Kyi finally be freed? And what next for this icon of democracy? I'm joined by her international lawyer and the president of the campaigning organisation Freedom Now, Jared Genser. Jared, what do you understand is the position about the release paper and the status of that now?
We understand that she was visited by representatives of the Home Ministry around noontime in Burma on Friday and was delivered some sort of paper. Ordinarily, one would hope in this case that it was a set of release papers that she would then sign and return, and then ultimately the order would be given for her actual release. But frankly, this has really been an assumption that has been circulating in the media. Frankly, when her house arrests have been extended, she also had a delivery of a paper, and that was a paper providing her notice that her house arrest has been extended. So far, no one has been able to speak to her since this incident of the visit took place. We know the visit took place because there was a convoy of police cars that came to her home, and this is typically how it's been done in the past. But in fact, we have yet to have actual confirmation that these were in fact release papers.
I see. So, and in fact, there's nobody, as you say, no one who can really contact her by phone to find out what went on.
No, indeed. She's been under very strict house arrest for the last 7 years with no internet, no telephone, no ability to send letters in and out, and visitors will have only been allowed really on the basis that the junta decided that they were willing to let people in.
And she's remarkably very well, isn't she, as far as we know?
Her lawyer actually has been able to see her quite recently in the last several days. In addition, he had seen her a month before that, and she is in good health and good spirits, obviously eager to re-engage in the domestic political situation in Burma. Ultimately, what she chooses to do, she'll announce herself. I can't speak on her behalf, of course, given that I'm not, frankly, able to talk to her directly either. But no doubt she will have a few things to say should she be released.
And what about if they try to limit the degree of campaigning she can do or something like that, that she's physically free but limited in certain ways?
Well, she has said through her lawyer, domestic lawyer, that she would not accept any conditions on her release.
Right.
The speculation as to why the delay in the release, today versus tomorrow, was that perhaps some conditions might be trying to be imposed by the junta, and she's negotiating on those items. Again, we have no real idea precisely what is happening. But she has said she would not accept any conditions on her release. How practically that would play out, it's unclear. But she's made very clear her own position on that.
And in fact, the regional press, in their comments and so on, have sort of been reluctantly welcoming, because obviously it wasn't by any means everything that people were hoping for. But in fact, the Indian Express said, quote, "If a door opens even a crack, the light must come in." Even if this is a much, much smaller step than would be your dream, as it were, it is a step forward, is it, if she is released tomorrow?
Look, ultimately, from my perspective, having been involved in Burma on and off for a decade and having worked on her behalf for 4 years, any view that suggests that it might be a door opening a crack is based exclusively on speculation and not based on any evidence. And frankly, I prefer perhaps because I'm a lawyer, but to deal in actual evidence. And what we've seen in the last 2 years as the military has tried to consolidate its rule is not a single compromise, not even a single iota of compromise on its behalf. The Constitution guarantees the military veto over decisions of the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. The election laws preclude all political prisoners and Aung San Suu Kyi from running for office. You saw a $500 per candidate registration fee in a country where the GDP per capita is less than that. And ultimately what you are seeing in the election results, in quotes, coming out, is that the regime will have won more than 80% of the seats in the federal and the regional parliaments. Not only guaranteeing that they maintain control, but that they remain in firm control. And so while, perhaps dealing with other governments or other situations, one might want to be optimistic as a general proposition. As I said, unless I see some other steps being taken by the regime that would indicate that they have an interest in compromising, for example, the release of all political prisoners. That, in my view, for example, would be a major step forward if they release the 2,200 political prisoners. But merely releasing her when we've seen twice before her released and nothing changing in the country is not indicative of anything by itself.
Well, I think you've given a very convincing list there to suggest that things have not improved very greatly in the last 7 years, and in fact with that sad and tragic list. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, and we look forward to talking again. And of course, we all hope, with you and your client as well, that there will be some good news this weekend. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
And now to the subject of Greece. The G20 group of the world's biggest economies met in South Korea this week to try and chart a way forward from the global recession and find ways of stopping it happening again. And one country that wasn't there but was still a huge part of what was being discussed was and is Greece. The country narrowly avoided bankruptcy back in April and had to be rescued with a €110 billion loan from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. But the cost is pretty bad too. It's a draconian austerity program of cuts and more cuts. With me now is the Greek Finance Minister, George Papaconstantinou, and we're going to be talking to him right now. Mr. Papaconstantinou, George, you've been now Finance Minister of Greece in these turbulent days for just over a year. What's the most important thing that you've learnt in that time, in the middle of all this crisis?
There's a number of lessons I could cite, and they're simple. Some would say even simplistic. I would say the first one is things tend to catch up with you. If you run for a long time a country with big fiscal problems, then eventually things catch up with you. And the same is true for Europe also. If Europe had not seen certain things coming, eventually it had to face them in a very short time period. Because we created a common currency area, but without all the tools to be able to deal with shocks to one country. So I think that that's an important lesson. The second lesson is that if you are in a crisis, time costs money. And if you delay taking decisions, and I think that's true, certainly in the European sense, then things become harder as you go along. Finally, a third, I would say, lesson is that stopgap measures are fine. You extinguish the fire, but then you have to build things from scratch. And that's true for Greece, where we're trying to rebuild institutions. It's true for Europe, where we're trying to have a permanent mechanism to avoid future crises of this sort.
Those are three very interesting thoughts. In light of all that, I mean, today there was this poll that was reprinted in one of the papers here today about how 67% of Greeks have a negative opinion of the government. That's in the middle of a great crisis and so on. Do you think they've got a point, or is it really just a question of waiting until they see that the progress is being made?
Well, Greeks have had a very rough year. There's no question about it. I mean, citizens that had absolutely nothing to do with the crisis were faced with a cut in salaries of up to 15% in 1 year. Pensioners had their pensions cut. Families had to deal with higher VAT rates. So it's completely understandable that there is bewilderment, there's anger. Sometimes it's directed towards the government, sometimes, more correctly I think, towards past governments for having brought the country to this situation. We still are commanding a lead in the polls. If elections were held tomorrow, we'd probably win them. So, and that's for a very simple reason. Even though people are hurting, they do understand that what's being done is necessary. There's no other way. And that we are trying to do it with as fairness as we can achieve, given the difficulty of the situation.
And what about the satisfying the Greek people on the one hand, or the international financial markets on the other? Who are the most difficult to convince?
I think both are difficult to convince in their own way. The financial markets look for immediate solutions and have instantaneous reactions. They often overreact. They often think they bring forward something that may happen far into the future, and you have an instantaneous negative reaction. And you have to convince them that what you're doing is in the right direction. With the Greek people, it's very different. With the Greek people, I think you have to convince them that their sacrifices are not in vain, and that at the end of the day, you're being fair in the way that you're treating them. That's what we're trying to do. And again, it is a difficult balance to achieve. I like to think that the two are not antithetical. At the end, if we manage to get back into financial markets, and if we manage to put the economy back in the right track, that will be something that the financial markets will appreciate, and that will certainly help the welfare of Greek citizens.
And what about in this situation, what about in terms of the future? You said that the economy next year will probably shrink by 3%, which is more than you thought.
Between 2.5% and 3%.
2.5% and 3%. But that's a bit more than you hoped before.
We had 2.6 before. It's hard to say.
It's all in the.
It's hard to say where exactly.
It's all in the risk.
That's right.
Reward ratio. But I mean, will it be 3%? Do you still think it'll be 3%? And how much is that a maximum? I mean, can it be anything and Greece survive, or could Greece not survive if it was, say, more than 5% or 7%?
This year we have a recession which is -4%. It's the biggest recession we've had in a very, very long time. But at the same time, we're doing the kind of changes, the kind of structural changes, by opening up closed professions, for example, by tackling loss-making public enterprises that unleash productive capacity and that give a positive supply shock to the economy. That's bound to be translated into better growth in the next years. So next year, I think that the -3 is an upper bound. I think it's going to be better than that. This is why the -2.6 of the program is more realistic. And from 2012 onwards, we'll go back into positive growth rates. Perhaps the last quarter of 2011 will already start seeing that change.
Would you say that, in fact, the euro has been good for Greece, or would it, looking back through recent history, would it have been better if there had never been anything like the Eurozone?
The euro has unquestionably been good for Greece.
Right. Yeah.
Even when we are in a difficult spot, to think, for example, that somehow Greece would today leave the euro and solve its problems by devaluing is a fallacy. It would lead to a real drop in living standards for people, a real drop in wages for the most vulnerable. Being in the euro has been a protective shield for Greece, not just because of the money that has come in from the European structural funds, but because it has meant stability, it has meant investment, new projects. And in that sense, you're in the euro, you have to play by the rules of the euro, and that's what we're trying to do.
So you can say now that you're confident, really, that within the next 2 to 3 years, the problems will have been, virtually all of them will have been solved.
It's a long road that we've started traveling on. I think the first step was to actually realize the size of the problem and be very open about it. We've made the first steps. It's not a process which finishes in 2 or 3 years. It's a process, you get out, if you will, of the very strict situation that you're with the EU and the IMF within the 3-year span that the program lasts. But the kind of transformations that are necessary in the Greek economy and the Greek society take much longer time. They have to do with an educational system that has to change from top to bottom. They have to do with a public sector that has to be more transparent and accountable to its citizens. They have to do with the mentalities that need to change. And that takes time. But I think the realization is there, the work is being done, and the commitment on behalf of the government is clearly there.
Thank you, George. Thank you very, very much. And now to former US President George W. Bush, who this week has been defending his use of waterboarding in his autobiography, Decision Points, which was published this week. He says waterboarding is not torture, it's an interrogation technique, which was important in getting information from terrorist suspects. The book also tells us more about the US response to 9/11 and the war on terror. As Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under President George W. Bush, Douglas Feith was the number 3 civilian at the Pentagon and at the heart of the war on terror strategy. He's joined us now. Douglas, the President's book is out this week, and I know you have not, with all your travels, had time to read it, but reading the accounts of it elsewhere and so on, you'll know that President Bush has defended waterboarding. Lots of people are therefore depressed by that. He's defending torture. He wouldn't call it torture. But would you call it torture?
Well, I know that he wouldn't defend torture. He wouldn't have defended torture as president. And the techniques that he approved, as he has said in various interviews, he approved on the basis of legal analyses from the competent legal officials in the U.S. government that they were not torture, that they were not illegal.
Yes, at the same time, obviously, most people would disagree with that, and a British court, as they say here, would regard waterboarding as torture and illegal. It contravenes Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and Downing Street stated this week that it came under the British government's definition of torture.
No, it won't surprise you. There are lawyers who disagree on these subjects.
Yes.
And
but the very fact that one of our leaders defends something seen as torture, though not by him, but nevertheless the very fact it's destroyed the old thing that was the one difference between the bad countries in the world and the good countries in the world, was that the good countries in the world never employed torture, and that has got blurred.
Well, no, but I don't think that that's correct. I don't think it does destroy that. What the president approved was not, in his view, as you point out, was not torture. It was not torture in the view of the lawyers who advised him. By the way, I was not one of his lawyers. I was a policy official, not a legal official. But the people that are set up by our Constitution to be the legal authorities for the executive branch studied the subject carefully. I mean, what distinguishes us and what is a source of pride is that we are a country that goes by a rule of law. And according to our rule of law, we have people who make these legal judgments. Now, the fact that there are lawyers elsewhere in the world who will challenge them, well, that's life. I mean, different lawyers have different opinions.
Or death, as the case may be.
But we have properly constituted authorities, and those people seriously, carefully, and in good faith made determinations that this is not torture. So I think it's just wrong to refer to it as torture as if that's an established fact. It's not an established fact. It's an issue about which lawyers debate.
Governments debate.
And
our
governments
government
debate.
here says it's torture. Your government says it's not.
Correct.
What about the overall issue? You were listing the 3 things that the Bush policy had to do, which was to protect the US homeland, to disrupt the terror network, and to counter Islamist ideology. Now, you're saying that's very different, Islamist ideology, from Islam.
Yes.
How do you define the difference between the two, and what do we do about the latter?
Well, there is an ideology that is motivating the various people who have been targeting civilians for murder to serve essentially their ideological cause. The ideology that is motivating them is an extremist ideology of a particular kind of political Islam, Islamism. That's different from Islam. And I think it's very important to understand that the people who denounce the ideology are not denouncing Islam as a religion. And certainly we know that not all Muslims are subscribers to this extremist ideology. There's nothing inevitable in Islam that leads to that the acceptance of that ideology, but that ideology is an important engine to motivate people to commit these terrible attacks.
And what about the ideology? You were saying we don't know how many people there are who embrace the ideology, as you
No, but we
put it.
do know that there are people who are taking important actions and killing people on the basis of that ideology. I mean, we see it. It's discussed on websites. There are preachers who are influential, who inspire people to commit these terrorist attacks.
But if we say there's which there is obviously over 1 billion Muslims in the world, roughly how many people come under your category of the alarmist front of the Islamists? I mean, would it be 25 people or 100,000?
I don't want to guess at numbers. It seems to me that one supposes it is substantially less than a majority, substantially less than a majority, for the reason that most Muslims do not live under Islamist governments. Most show no interest or desire to live under Islamist governments. The record of the several Islamist governments that we've seen is a very poor record. It's a record of tyranny and of brutality and of murder in places like Iran or Taliban, Afghanistan, or Gaza under Hamas. Where Islamist extremist ideologies have actually achieved political power, or for that matter in Anbar province in Iraq under the Zarqawi Al-Qaeda in Iraq organization, where the Islamists have actually achieved power, the extremists, the results for the people, for the Muslims living under them have been terrible. So I mean, one has the distinct impression that most Muslims do not want to live under these extremists. Muslims are debating amongst themselves, and you see it in the literature and you see it on the internet. They're debating amongst themselves what kinds of societies they want to have, what kind of rules they want to live by, what is their concept of Islam, and who they want to fly the banner of Islam. And these are all things that are being debated more or less intensely among various Muslim communities. Our interest is that the people who have an interest in tolerance, in peace, in modernization and improving the quality of life of Muslims generally, that those people should prevail in that debate.
Thank you for being with us, Douglas.
Glad to talk to you.
We appreciate it. Our thanks to Douglas Feith there. And picking up from that after the break, we'll speak to an author who believes he has an insight into exactly why young Muslims turn to extremism. We'll also hear more about the massacre of Christians in Iraq, and on a somewhat lighter note, we'll talk about cricket's tumultuous year and the upcoming Ashes to boot. We'll be right back.